So we now have online Claudia Benham from Queensland University of Technology. She's presenting on envisioning Great Barrier Reef regional futures through public deliberation. Thank you, Claudia.
Hi everyone, and thanks so much, Michelle. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara people here in Brisbane, where I'm based at UQ. So if I could just get a bit of a hands up, or if you could let me know if you can't hear me throughout, I'll try and keep an eye on the chat as well. I wanted to talk to you today about using public deliberation as a tool to kind of support communities living along the reef to discuss and make decisions about the future in a way that takes into account the different interests and values that are present in the community at the moment, but that also takes into account the interests of future generations and the environment. And I do have slides, so I might just wait until those ones pop up. Or I can share them if that's easier. I can share them, yeah. Okay. Okay, so hopefully that's working and you can see them okay. All right, thank you very much. First of all, wonderful photo, I just love it. And it's the background for our Padlet as well. So if you're online or if you're in person, please have a look at the Padlet and add your contributions, and we'll do a wrap up later. Okay, so public deliberation, I want to use a local example from Townsville just to give you a bit of a sense of the potential of these processes, what they look like and what they can achieve. And I should say I'm a human geographer, so I was at JCU and this process was done with others at JCU, Dr. Stephanie Douce, who's a spatial scientist, Dr. Annie Bauer-Cibiello, who now works for NQ Dry Tropics, and our colleagues at the University of Canberra, who are specialists in deliberative democracy. So a really interdisciplinary process, which I think is really important for all reef social science, but particularly for a project like this. So it was a meeting that we did over about 3 days in 2018, and we had some community members from Townsville come and join us at JCU. So we had 9 people. It was a very small process, and public deliberation tends to be done in these kinds of fairly small processes. And we had people come from, the only prerequisite for people to attend was that they lived in Townsville. So we did recruited people, did some sampling using the Australia Post database. So it was a very broad group of people and not residents who had a particular interest or expertise with the reef. So just people who had an interest in the topic, which was about the future of the community and the reef. So trying to bring those two topics together a bit. As Carly said in her really excellent presentation, sometimes that narrative, the public narrative or the discourse around things like coral versus coal or regional development and the reef can be quite polarised. So we were trying to basically use this process to find a way through some of those debates. So we had a small group of people come and they were selected at random. We also did some surveys with them 3 times throughout the process, so before, during and after, just to track any changes in their attitudes. And we did some participatory mapping as well to identify what types of values people associated with marine and coastal habitats around Townsville, and also to create a little bit of a shared understanding or shared language about the kinds of issues we were talking about. So public deliberation is a form of choice making and discussion that really focuses on understanding the interests and the values that underpin the decisions that we make and our preferences. And it's a very other regarding process. So the aim of it is really to look at costs and benefits and trade-offs that we make when we pursue certain values or priorities. So, for example, if we were going to make a decision about building a new road, deliberation might say, well, we also need to think about the values and interests that underpin that decision. And it's quite useful, I think, for the reef because it allows us to sort of look at that middle ground or try to sort of get below the polarisation and sort of politicisation of some of the discussions about the future of the reef and and local communities and try to work out actually what does the community want and what kind of things do they want to see in their region in future for future generations, so our kids and grandkids, but also for the environment. And those interests can be quite hard to represent in typical forums. So we asked people about a huge sort of range of issues in that process, and we kept it very open because we didn't want to limit the discussion at all. So you can see an example of some of the priorities that were talked about in that process. And I just want to focus on a couple of them, which are those two at the bottom: jobs and employment, and also protecting the local marine and terrestrial environment, which is, of course, what we're all here today to talk about. Just to share just a little snippet of some of the results. You can see down the bottom here in that red box that jobs and the environment were really the key priorities for people throughout the process. And particularly at the beginning, jobs and employment were really important. And of course, we know that jobs and the local economy has been a huge challenge for Townsville, particularly in the last 5 or 6 years. But also protecting the local environment. And that was something that in some ways was a little bit surprising because this wasn't framed as an environmental process. And it was important. It wasn't the number one issue at the beginning, but as the process progressed, people really expressed strong preferences to prioritise the environment. And within those ecosystems, coral reefs came out really strongly as the number one ecosystem that people resonated with and that they valued. And I think that reflects what we already know from the other research around what people value and love in the reef. So again, you can see those coral reefs coming out quite strongly as a really important ecosystem for people. Also, we did have a lot of discussions around the role of seagrass, mangroves and estuaries in promoting fisheries habitats. But coral reefs were really important for people. And interestingly, and I think this is also something that we know quite well from other research, people's values didn't necessarily align with the areas that they used. So you can see here on the left-hand side on that y-axis are the points that people mapped, the numbers of points. And these were areas that they used the most and that they valued. And you can see most of the time people are using areas that are along the coast or areas that are quite accessible rather than reef ecosystems, and there are barriers for people accessing those habitats. But people nevertheless, sorry, Umberto?
Time is almost over.
Almost up. Okay, great. Perfect. So we know now that those values of ecosystems don't necessarily align well with what people, the areas that people are using, but they value them nevertheless. So just a very brief summary. We know that the narratives around conservation and economic development in the reef are often quite polarised at that political level or at that public level in social media. But we know also that public deliberation can provide a way through. And I just think it's so exciting because seeing the transformation of people's preferences throughout that process was just phenomenal, including some people who were climate change deniers, who then one lady in particular who came up at the end and said, wow, I'm really convinced about climate change now, and I'm going to go home and tell my husband about it and tell my family. So that was really, really cool for us to see. So coral reefs are obviously hugely important, and they resonate, the values of the coral reefs resonate with people in the local community, and people want to protect them, but there are also those other values. And one of the things that I forgot to mention was that linkage with catchments. And we saw throughout the process people really starting to recognise and discuss the linkages between terrestrial catchment ecosystems and the reef. So that was also something that we found particularly exciting and encouraging. So thanks very much, and I'm happy to take questions. Oops.
Is there one quick question for Claudia? We're just trying to pick up a little bit of time we've lost.
Yeah, sure.
Or you can always catch up with Claudia afterwards. One question, go.
Really, really quick. So when you asked about the different habitat or ecosystem, did you give them the choice, or people were just naming which habitat they thought they were the most important for them?
Oh, yes, that's really interesting. Is that Umberto?
Sorry?
No. Okay. Yes, so we gave them the choice, but before they did the survey, we did a participatory mapping exercise, which was very open, and that gave people the chance to talk to the person who was running the mapping. So we had somebody sitting there with each person to map their points, because sometimes it can be difficult. If you haven't used ArcGIS before, anyone who's used it knows that there's quite a big learning curve. So we had somebody sitting next to them, and they could share their perspective. So a lot of people said, oh, I used this area for fishing, but I didn't realise there was seagrass there, particularly with seagrass, which can be a little harder to sort of recognise. So yeah, we kept it very open, but then when they did the survey, we had categories for people to fill out just to make things easier.
Thanks so much, Claudia.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.